evening. Good evening. Good evening. Can we get everyone to take their seats, please? On behalf of the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you tonight for what is going to be a wonderful evening of listening to the truth. My name is Gloria Crowell. I'm an Oakland resident, and I serve at Allen Temple Baptist Church, the nonprofit Health and Social Services, and I'm happy to welcome everyone here this evening. I'm just been so excited, I can't even tell you, all week long, just to know that we're going to have the privilege and the honor to hear from someone who paved the way for all of us. Our theme, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Of course, you know, this is from the title of the book by Dr. Martin Luther King from 1967. It's been a wonderful theme that has carried through the month of January, starting at Dr. King's birthday, all through Black History Month. This is bringing us back to looking at what was pinned for us, things that we should live through, lessons for us to live out correctly. Of course, one of the most wonderful quotes that we heard, tell me if you remember who said this, "I did what my conscience told me to do, and you can't fail if you do that." Of course, that was a quote from our guest speaker this evening, Anita Hill, which we'd like to welcome. Of course, we can't do any of this work, bringing you these wonderful lecture series, without our sponsors. And let me just share our sponsors for you this evening. Major sponsors, Gilead Science. I'd like to recognize Robin Washington, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, please. We cannot forget our own Kaiser Permanente. I'd like to recognize Tracy Ward, Community Benefit Programs, Northern California region. And of course, lead sponsor, the Kapoor Center for Social Impact. We'd like to recognize Frida Kapoor-Klein. Also, there are contributing sponsors that we rightly need to recognize. Box.org, Boxer and Gerson Attorneys at Law, Cisco, the East Bay Community Foundation, East Bay Regional Park District, IBEW Local 595, the Institute for Community Leadership, of course, our very own Marriott, PG&E Pandora, and Planned Parenthood Marmate. And finally, we have supporters as well. And we'd like to recognize the Alameda Bar Association, California Waste Solutions, Coliseum Lexus, Albertsons Safeway, and our good labor friends overseeing the House logistics tonight, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IATSE, Local 107, Mr. Omar Sabeh. And as we usually do at these wonderful programs, we cannot neglect to bring awareness from our local elected officials, and I'd just like to have them wave to you at this time. Karen Weinstein, Linda Handy, and Dr. William Riley, all from the Peralta Community College District Board of Trustees. We have Supervisors Keith Carson, representing District 5, and Supervisor Nate Miley, representing District 4. We'd like to recognize Nancy O'Malley, our Alameda County District Attorney, Judge Trina Thompson, and Sarah Ting from Abel Gilliam's office from the Oakland City Council, as well as Jovenka Beckles from the Richmond City Council. I'd like to take this opportunity to bring up to the stage and welcome our own Dr. Marie Elaine Burns. Marie is a visionary, a risk taker. She's energetic and passionate on the exploration of new ideas. I'd love for her to come, and please recognize Dr. Burns at this time.
Good evening. It is always my pleasure and great honor on behalf of Marriott College and in partnership with the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center to welcome all of you and our distinguished speaker, Dr. Anita Hill, to the second in this spring 2018 Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris lecture series. I'm looking forward to hearing a word from Dr. Anita Hill, outstanding lawyer, university professor, and author. Once again, the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris lecture series brings to us a lecture that is timely at this particular point in our country's history, given that Dr. Hill has been named the chairperson for the Commission on Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equality in the Workplace. Dr. Hill was quoted saying, "It is time to end the culture of silence. This moment presents us with an unprecedented opportunity to make a real change." As you may have heard me say before, I'm humbled and proud to be the president of an institution where social justice is embedded into the DNA of the college community, of a college that instills in its community the need for social change, education, and the continuation of the great legacy of the Black Panther Party, of a college that is supportive of and partners with the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center, that works with young people to develop nonviolent leadership and conflict resolution skills to positively impact their neighborhoods, communities, the nation, and the world, and of a college that co-sponsors this much-needed Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris lecture series that brings us together to hear from and interact with the pioneers and leaders in the social justice movement that must continue to effectively impact the culture of this country. I am proud to be a part of this lecture series that causes us to keep social justice and social change alive in our minds and our daily actions, of a lecture series that encourages all of us to keep the dream alive. Thank you.
Keeping the dream alive is so important for all of us. We'd like to bring up to the stage now someone is no stranger to those words, keeping the dream alive. Dr. Roy Wilson, a published author, scholar, and civil rights and a nonviolence expert, and of course, director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center. Please welcome Roy now.
Professor Hill, welcome. It's an honor to be here. Mr. Charles Malone, welcome to our friends and colleagues and comrades, our constituents that come to lectures, and those coming to your first lecture. Welcome. You are in your home. I'd like to ask everyone to join the students and staff of the Freedom Center in acknowledging our incredible board of directors. First, our chairman, the Honorable Elihu Harris. Vice Chair Sandra Andrews. Secretary Royale Roberts. Director Alton Jelks. Director Audrey Jones-Taylor. Director Carol Johnson. Director William Riley. And Director Michael Leidy. At the Freedom Center, we train ourselves to see everything in the context of time and place. What time is it? Where are we? We're coming out of a very dark and difficult moment in America. In 2017, we experienced over 5 disastrous hurricanes. They battered the shores of America and came inland, causing over $400 billion of damage at the loss of more than 650 lives. We also suffered a human-caused hurricane that came upon us 15 months ago, battering and brutally attacking the human and civil rights of the people of America. It was a hurricane born in greed and white supremacy. It attacked health care. It attacked immigrant rights. It attacked our religious right to practice our religion in our own way. It was a violent, human-caused hurricane. The good news, what time is it? It's springtime. It's hope time. It's happy time. How can we be happy? Because there's no longer a hurricane. The people have stood up. It's become a bothersome storm. That's a victory. People have stood up, spoke up, walked out, marched, ran for election, and won. It is springtime. It is resurrection time. It is the time that we are all together planting and cultivating, and this fall we will harvest a stronger democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Something comes to mind, and I want to say, yes, we will. Yes, we can. Se puede. Yes, we will. We are the ones that we've been looking for to make this change. And you can look around this room this evening, and you can see the army that we have to move forward. Now, to bring reflections, I'd like to welcome Meredith Brown, who is also with the Peralta Community College District. Meredith serves as a person who can help secure Peralta's future with her over 20 years of complex litigation experience. We welcome Dr. Brown.
Good evening, my beloved community. I am so happy to be here. There is nowhere else on earth I would rather be than right here to say thank you to Professor Anita Hill, to Barbara Lee, to Elihu Harris, to the people who fight for us and who speak the truth and who have the courage and the hope to help us find our voice and find our path towards a more just society. It's been hard just waiting to have an opportunity to hear this lecture tonight. Just the idea has made me so inspired. And when I was asked to give these reflections, the only thing that came to mind was hope and courage. And what is hope? It is the ability to look at our problems of violence, of food insecurity, of illiteracy, of human trafficking, of corruption and apathy, and run towards the conflict. Not turn away in disgust, but walk towards that conflict knowing that we can move forward together and bring about a better society. Because people of good conscience, as Martin Luther King said, will continue the struggle for a society that does not accept the degradation of other human beings as a collateral effect of a complex civilization. Now, what does that mean? I mean that immigration reform is not achieved by the criminalization and deportation of mothers and fathers and students and neighbors. I mean that affordable health care does not require the escalation of drug prices and exclusion of preventative health practices to be practical and functional and feasible. I mean that quality, affordable access to education can be student-centered and serve the most needy among us, at the same time that we provide training to our students to get stable jobs where students can rise up out of that food insecurity and housing insecurity and also learn to be critical thinkers that can be leaders in our community. We are in a time where hope and courage are the essential remedy for a false rhetoric that seeks to divide and erode our ability to approach problems with intelligence and civil discourse. We are in a time when our institutions of government are locked in a false debate about whether to invest in free community college as a path to closing our skills gap and provide a more productive economy, as opposed to following a boondoggle that would have us evaluate a student's ability to repay their student loans as a measure of whether we should admit them to college. This false debate would have us believe that a reasonable response to hunger is to provide canned goods and processed foods instead of vouchers so that mothers and fathers can buy fresh vegetables and groceries to feed families with limited means so they can become strong and learn in school. But we have seen what hope and courage can do. Hope and courage in 2012 now, we're talking about a dawn that is still upon us. In 2012, hope and courage resulted in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which provides protections for victims of domestic violence regardless of gender. Hope and courage resulted in the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which we're using today in case after case to strike down gerrymandering and unconstitutional voting laws. Hope and courage created the Affordable Care Act, which has expanded Medicare and provided health insurance to more than 11 million people who formerly were considered uninsurable and who were uninsured. The Martin Luther King lecture series that Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris have given us shows us that our history, our path, our reality has allowed us to become a remarkable society that is a guiding example of a system that promised liberty and has legislated civil liberties, and that is our legacy, and that is our promise, and that is our goal, and that is why we have the hope and the courage to not just come here tonight and listen to Professor Hill inspire us again, but also the hope and courage to have that dawn that Roy Wilson told us about, to have that springtime. Now, I'm going to get off this podium and let y'all hear what you came to hear. But I just want to close with the words that Martin Luther King wrote when he was in the Birmingham jail. the letter from Birmingham. He said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outsider agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider." Now, we hear people telling this all the time. People are outsiders. Our neighbors are outsiders. We do not believe that. We are here together. We are in this together. And we are here to hear the words of hope and courage and inspiration from Professor Hill. And I remember that Senate Judiciary hearing. I was a lawyer. I had passed the bar. And I remembered as if I was in that room with her. My stomach was in knots, and my heart was pounding. And I felt like I was there to say, go on. Go on. Tell the truth. And today, we get to hear her say those words of hope and courage. And I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Meredith Brown. So wonderful to know that we have a wonderful history that we're keeping in front of us as we move forward into the future at Peralta. Now, how many of you all in the crowd are on Instagram? Raise your hands. How many of you in the crowd follow the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center? Raise your hands. Well, I have to say that I too am on Instagram, and I too was following the delegation as these wonderful students of the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center were on the congressional delegation. Just last week, the wonderful photos of them with Congressman John Lewis crossing the bridge. This is inspiration to me because it gives me hope and assurance that the future is bright. I have two boys myself, ages 18 and 20. I believe I've done a good job with them, and one of my sons has actually been across the bridge, but to hear the wonderful inspiration right here in our own backyard from these phenomenal students at the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center is something you don't want to miss. I welcome the delegation to come up now so we could hear directly from them about their experience on this congressional delegation.
The Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center has the privilege and honor of accompanying Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Yes, she speaks for us. Woo! On the Congressional Civil Rights Pilgrimage. We went on a historical visit to Memphis, Tennessee, Selma, Birmingham, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama. We go on these journeys because in America today we have to cultivate compassion, conscience, and civility. The Freedom Center every year has the honor of selecting Alameda County youth to represent us on these historical journeys. In America, we have a long journey to go. And we have to ensure that young people learn and understand the sacrifice that it took for us to be where we're at today and the sacrifice it's going to take for us to get where we need to go. Thank you.
We would like to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee for being the reason we were able to experience this amazing pilgrimage. And we would also like to express gratitude to Congressman John Lewis of Georgia and the Faith and Politics Institute for putting on this pilgrimage that has changed so many people for the past 20 years. Throughout the pilgrimage, we learned that when facing hatred, pain, adversity, the most difficult but most vital thing one can do is forgive and continue to love. We were able to spend time with the people who fought and sacrificed, those who lost loved ones during the civil rights movement. Yet the interesting thing is that none of those people walk with hatred in their hearts. While it is not easy to let go of what one has done to us, if we continue to carry contempt and hatred, we only harm ourselves and those around us. If we are to begin the road towards changing America, we have to learn to forgive and begin to love those who hate, those who harm, and those who wish to maintain the status quo. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Charlotte Potes. We at the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center would like to say thank you to everyone who supported us well on this trip and followed us along the way. Without your support, none of this would have been possible. Before going on this trip, I wanted to learn to be more dedicated to the movement and develop sacrifice, because this pilgrimage, while amazing, did require a lot of sacrifice. We stayed up late, woke up early, and we smiled all the time. This was to achieve our goal of shining our light as bright as we can so that we can bring hope to people. I believe that we achieved this goal, and this trip at the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center was truly an experience that we will never forget. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Angela Drake. And before we embarked on this journey, we had all set a purpose to struggle with ourselves. And we asked ourselves, what does that look like? And it looks like struggling how Martin struggled. It looks like struggling how Malcolm struggled. And they didn't just give up their jobs. They didn't just give up their family time. They gave up their lives. And what does that mean, to give up your life? It means to be dedicated to something that's bigger than yourselves. And that's something we learned here on the Civil Rights Pilgrimage, is to how to dedicate ourselves to a bigger cause. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Katie True, and we express our gratitude to Congresswoman Barbara Lee and the MLK Freedom Center for this amazing and profound opportunity. In our capitalistic society, we are often taught the every man for himself mentality. We are taught that money is more important than friendship. We tend to make this ignorance our agenda. It is a cycle of selfishness and fatalistic thoughts. My goal on this pilgrimage was to develop my capacity to leave this agenda behind. Witnessing Democrats and Republicans, people of all races and people of all ages unite, taught me that it's the human race that must be our primary agenda. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to first thank the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center for allowing us to participate in such a life-changing experience. My name is David Gaines. And before this trip, we hope to become more dedicated and to practice more humility. And the trip required, like Charlotte said, that we stay up late, wake up early, and become molded into what we were meant to be. We learned from the heroes of the movement. We learned to stand up. We learned to keep on keeping on. We learned that we have been touched by the spirit of history. We will never forget the lessons. We will never forget the stories. So we would like to thank this wonderful organization that takes ordinary youth to do extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. In just a few minutes, we're going to share a very brief slideshow with you. And the slideshow features the very, very hard work of our young people. Congresswoman Lee, weren't they spectacular? You know, I just have to say, watching these young people, our amazing representatives, interacting with 30 members of Congress, national sponsors, and bringing out in many settings the more sort of profound and raw and tender expressions of the human experience in the context that we shared together, fantastic. At this time, we need you to all please take out this little slip that's in your program. This is our opportunity to ask everyone here tonight to join in the work of the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center in whatever way you feel you can. There will be an opportunity to make a donation this evening. Our young people will be passing baskets. But I'd also just briefly like to point out that there's opportunities for volunteer involvement on the back of this little card. And if you could consider a monthly donation, there's a place to indicate that as well. We do what we do at the Freedom Center because of everyone in this room. And to our board members, I can tell you, I think just about every one of our program year sponsors, Alameda County, Kaiser Permanente are here tonight. And to all of you, we thank you. We cannot do the work we do at the Freedom Center without all of us here together. So with that, we'll turn to our slides. Thank you.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. Come on and wade in the water, you gotta wade. Dressed up in white, God's gonna trouble the water. You know they must be the children of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, now you wanna wade in the water. The water. See those children dressed in black. God's gonna trouble the water. You know, they come a long way, ain't turning back. God's gonna trouble the water. See the children, they're dressed up in blue. You know my God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah, see it looks like my people, they're coming on through. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water. Well, everybody knows wait in the water. Trouble the water. See those children dressed in red.
that Moses led. My God, God's gonna trouble the water. See those children all dressed in green. God's gonna trouble the water. You know they're moving down to that Jordan stream. Well, God's gonna trouble the water. Come on, children, down wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. In the water, my God's gonna trouble the water. You know, some say Peter and some say Paul. My God, my God. Well, you know there ain't but one God made us all.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind donations. We'd like to welcome up our former mayor and former chancellor of the Peralta Community College District, Elihu Harris. Please join me in welcoming him.
So good evening. Last month we had Black History Month, and we had the Honorable James Clyburn continue our theme and our conversation about where do we go from here, chaos or community. Earlier this month, we celebrated International Women's Day. And we always have to remember it's about women. Sometimes we forget how important women are, not only in our community, in our daily lives, in our personal lives, but in the world. About 30 years ago, I got an award from the California Abortion Rights League for my support for choice. And when I was getting the award, Kathy Neal said, "Why are they giving you an award?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You don't have a choice." And I remembered that I don't, but I have a role and a responsibility to support women who do. When one thinks back on history and all of the contributions of women who nurtured families during slavery, for Harriet Tubman, who helped slaves escape to the North with the Underground Railroad, who said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." For Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's suffrage in the early 1900s. For Rosa Parks, who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. To women like Shirley Chisholm, who was the first woman to run for president of the United States. To women who stand up with courage, with dignity, often without funds, often without support, we remember that courage is the legacy that we have to follow. And like Meredith Brown, I was mayor of Oakland. I thought that took courage. But I watched Professor Anita Hill stand up in Congress before the United States Senate. Some people who were angry because she spoke the truth, but some people who threatened her because she spoke the truth. And I said, I wonder if I would have had the courage to stand up and be the one. And then I saw in 2001, our own Barbara Lee stand up and be the one. When everybody else in the Congress voted yes, she voted no. And it calls upon each of us today, not in Washington, D.C., not at the United Nations, but right here in Oakland, California, and say, with homelessness, with poverty, with all of the problems we have in our community, if we are called upon to stand up, to speak the truth, will we be the one? That's the challenge we all have to face, being the one, not just being one of the many, but we need to stand up in your church, in your home, before the city council, the board of supervisors, the California legislature. Tell truth to power. Speak truth to power regardless of the consequence. Let history judge whether you are right or wrong. But never, never fail to stand up, because no one else will. Always, you be prepared to be the one. Thank you.
Our own Honorable Elihu Harris. Let's give him another round of applause, please. And now we'd like to welcome to the stage the person who fights our battles in Washington every day. You can see her, you watch her, you there for her, but remember, she's always there for you. Let's welcome our very own Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Well, good evening. I got back at 11:30 this morning. I am glad to be home and glad to be with you tonight, so thank you so much for coming out. I tell you, I get my inspiration from my constituents, from you who continue to stay woke. That's so important right now. Gloria, thank you so much for your leadership and for doing all of the heavy lifting tonight. We really appreciate you coming in, standing in the gap, but also for your unbelievable work as it relates to HIV and AIDS and healthcare. So give Gloria a round of applause. And to Dr. Marie Lane Burns of Merritt College, to Meredith, to all of the board members of the Freedom Center, to the trustees, to Elihu Harris, let me just thank you, Roy, Karen, all of you for your leadership and really for providing the Martin Luther King Freedom Center what it takes to make an impact on our young people's lives. You all are doing this way beyond the call of duty, and give them a round of applause because they have been doing this for many, many, many years. And let me take a moment to acknowledge and thank Frida Kapor-Klein, without whom tonight's event would not be happening, Frida. But let me give Frida a round of applause, because I want to just say a little bit about Frida real quick. Frida and her husband, Mitch, they're incredible philanthropists in our community, and they run the Kapor Center for Social Impact, which is working to increase, and I have seen and witnessed these young people who they are touching each and every day. They're working to increase diversity and inclusion in the tech sector, and they provide real opportunities to our young people who have been shut out of this industry and who would never have an opportunity had it not been for what Frida and Mitch are doing. So thank you, Frida, for your unwavering commitment to our young people and really supporting tonight's forum on civic engagement. We couldn't have done this without you, and it's so good to see you. Okay, now you know these young people, you know, some call them kids, but I don't, because they are so mature, they're thoughtful, they're dedicated, and they're engaged young people, and I'm constantly impressed by them. As you heard tonight and as you saw tonight, they are not shy in seizing the opportunity to speak out and be strong voices for change, even when they're interviewing a great warrior like Congressman John Lewis. regardless of what path their lives take, if they choose to go into business, advocacy work, the tech sector, government, wherever and whatever, they will draw on the training that the Freedom Center has provided them. And so I am so proud of our young people. We formed the Martin Luther King Freedom Center for Nonviolence and Civic Participation, Conflict Resolution in East Oakland in 1996. And so the center has withstood the test of time. And I just want you to give our young people another round of applause because they represent you all over the country. Every day we are seeing more and more people stand up and speak out when they see injustice. Tonight, we're here to celebrate one of those brave individuals who stood up, spoke out, and started a movement. A movement that came to be called the Year of the Woman back in 1992. How fitting it is that we have her join us during this Women's History Month, since she certainly made history not only for herself, but for so many women who were inspired by her example to make history themselves. When Dr. Hill spoke out against the injustice that she suffered, she was not universally praised. Instead, she really was humiliated by a committee of white male senators and had their motivations had her motivations called into question. Can you believe that? Called into question by them in the media. But she still rose. She still rose. She held her head up high and demanded an acknowledgement that what was done to her was wrong. She didn't let the abuse she was subjected to dissuade her from working to create a world where other young women wouldn't be made to accept sexual harassment as simply a part of their job. She rose and she started a movement, one person. It led to more women being elected to public office and many more accomplishments, which Frida, who will introduce her in a minute, will tell us about. But to the young people in the audience tonight, I want you all to listen closely to what Professor Hill has to say. Each of you has the potential to make an impact like she did. I want you to see that her story is similar to many of yours. Never doubt that the time is right to do what is right as she did, because it's always right. It may seem lonely at the time, but history will be on your side as it was on hers. It was on hers. So Anita, welcome to Oakland, the home of the Black Panther Party. The heart and soul of the resistance movement, the most progressive and diverse congressional district in the country, where my residents and my constituents, they continue to speak out, they don't back down, and they continue to fight for peace and justice each and every day, and they continue to stay woke. Thank you again.
Wakanda forever. Now let's bring up, please, entrepreneur, activist, and leader in organizational culture and diversity right here in our own community, Frida Kapoor-Klein.
Good evening. It's a privilege of enormous proportion to be on this stage, speaking after Congresswoman Barbara Lee, my rep here in Oakland. We live and work in Oakland, and introducing Professor Anita Hill. Two women of remarkable courage, clarity of vision, strong values, and genuinely warm and compassionate women. I am proud and humbled to know both of them. As Congresswoman Lee said, my job is to introduce Professor Anita Hill. Many may not know her background, so I just want to give you a little bit about her. When Anita is asked who her heroes are, the first person she names is her mother. Anita was born in Lone Tree, Oklahoma, and she may or may not know that I lived 3 years in Oklahoma. She was the youngest of 13 children, and her parents were farmers. Her family came from Arkansas, where her great-grandparents and her maternal grandfather, Henry Eliot, were born into slavery. All 13 of the Hill children were expected to go to college. After graduating as valedictorian from Morris High School in Oklahoma, she enrolled at Oklahoma State University, received a bachelor's degree in psychology with honors in 1977. She went on to Yale Law School, obtaining her JD with honors in 1980. Anita's law school classmates expected her to be testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee one day, but they anticipated that she would be nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court herself. Instead, her strong moral compass meant that she had to tell the truth about the sexual harassment she suffered when working for Clarence Thomas. As Anita has explained it, she had to protect the public from someone unfit to serve and to protect the integrity of the court. In the 26 and a half years since her testimony in October of 1991, Anita has inspired countless people to stand up for justice. During those hearings, I had the honor to be an on-air commentator on NBC with Tom Brokaw, and I listened real time to her testimony. It was riveting. Her grace and integrity and courage were evident in October '91, but they have characterized her steadily over these many years. I have the honor of working with Professor Hill now on the Hollywood Commission on Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equality in the Workplace. I continue to see that Professor Hill has a remarkable ability to keep her eye on the goal, true equality and equity, to mark progress towards those goals, but also to be clear-eyed about the setbacks and sidesteps along the way. Her perseverance and poise in the face of injustice is remarkable. I've had the great impact to witness her impact on young people, especially young women of color. Congresswoman Lee mentioned some of our programs. This will be the 15th year that we are running SMASH, the Summer Math and Science Honors Academy, a residential program for low-income, underrepresented high school students of color. We started on the UC Berkeley campus. We are now on 7 campuses. We're opening Detroit and Philadelphia this summer. But you're waiting to hear from Professor Hill. I know you will be inspired by her words tonight, as millions have been inspired by her actions and character for nearly 27 years. She is our voice through chaos and community. It's my great privilege to welcome Professor Anita Hill.
Good evening. Wow. Thank you so much. I tell you, I have had a long week, but I feel like in this room with this energy, with all of these wonderful people, that it just began. This is just what I waited for. Now, I have so many people to thank, and I want to start by thanking the young leaders from the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center who gave me a wonderful opportunity this afternoon. Now, at one point, one of the young people said to me, "How do you maintain hope?" And I gave them the answer about how I maintain hope, and that is by thinking about the progress that we have made, not just in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my parents and my grandparents. But in truth, as I left there, I realized that I maintain hope because of them. They are our hope. And they are here to live up to that and live up to those expectations. And you got a glimpse of it from the ones who were here on the stage tonight. I want to thank the organizers. Roy Wilson and Karen, and I hope that I won't botch your name. Bulky? Oh, okay. Thank you, really, for all of the work you do, but especially for getting me here and allowing me to receive this warm welcome. I want to thank, of course, Frida Caper-Klein for that gracious and generous introduction. And, of course, I'm going to save my last set of thank yous for two incredibly inspired and inspiring leaders from your community. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. The work that you do in Congress, the work that you do on the House floor and really in committees really only begins to tell your value. Your value is not just to the community of Oakland, and it's not just about the bills that you'll pass, but it's the value for all of us around the country of knowing that we have a voice in Washington, D.C., who will speak for all of us. Whether we get a chance to vote for you or not, you will speak for us, and we all are very thankful to have you. And I know you in Oakland are proud to call her your Congresswoman. I was listening to Elihu Harris, and I have to say, we could go home now. Your passion still shows, and I know you've left elected office, but your passion for people still shows. And whatever you do, whether it's a regent, board of directors, board of trustees, and any of the community work you do, reflects that passion. I just know, I feel it, and I also felt it from the warm welcome that you got here tonight. It is an honor to be able to give a lecture in your names. So thank you for having me. Thank you for establishing this lecture series, and it is now up to me to make good on the promise that you made when you gave this series, when you supplied, made this offering to the community of Oakland. And I'm going to actually start with a quote, part of a quote that my sister in the law, Ms. Brown, gave. But I want us to think about it because, these last week, someone, I think it was Mr. Harris, who mentioned Women's History Month and International Women's Day, and we've just come off the Black History Month, and right before that we were celebrating Martin Luther King holiday.
And so to me, all of those things really come together. Of course I celebrate Black History Month. It is who I am. I celebrate Women's History Month. And of course, we all who believe in freedom celebrate Martin Luther King, Jr., because we know how precious it is. And so that quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," is something that we all hear. But I'm going to go back to the part and read sort of another part of that quote, which Ms. Brown has already shared with you, and that is, and I'll start it out, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly." And so I arrived here from Bakersfield yesterday, but I know that, in fact, my journey to Oakland began in 1991 when I testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I want all of us to think about concepts of fairness and equality in this era, in this moment, when we are all weathering the storm of the most recent presidential election. And I want us to consider Dr. King's words, what it means, in fact, to be in this network of mutuality. What does it mean to think about all of us in a single garment of destiny, in particular as it relates to sexual harassment and sexual assault? Now, a few years ago, I wrote a book about the housing crisis of 2008 and 2009, and I situated the book around the housing crisis because, to me, it was a moment in history in which we were seeing devastating losses, financial losses, home losses, lost dreams. And I don't think we've ever really fully taken account of what it meant, that those losses were more than just the financial losses. And they were more than just one-time losses. They are losses that will be spread to the next generation and maybe even beyond. There were loss of hope, loss of dreams, a loss of a sense of belonging. And so I started to consider what home meant. And I came up with this idea that home is, in fact, in its highest sense, a place where we look for safety and security. Home is a place that allows us to grow and develop. And finally, a true home offers us a sense of being in a space where our contributions are recognized and rewarded. We all want to be at home. We all want to feel at home wherever we are, whether we're thinking about home as our residential place of living, or whether we're thinking about our nation as our home. And I am deeply troubled that, in fact, many of us today aren't quite sure whether we can still be at home in this country. We aren't quite sure if we truly belong here, if we're truly safe here. And we know that it's true. There are certain communities who are not safe in this time. We also know, though, and I hope you'll bear with me in helping in trying to help you understand that being at home and feeling at home is key to equality. It's key to justice. It's key to freedom in the 21st century. And so, to paraphrase the words of Dr. King, inequality anywhere, even in our residential homes or our workplaces or our schools, is a threat to our individual equality everywhere. Now, tonight, I could be talking about any number of issues. When I talk about home, I could be talking about immigration, and that issue has been raised in the troubling times that we are in now. I could be talking about domestic violence, and we've seen that issue on the front pages of our paper, and centered around a story that seemingly was of sanctioning domestic violence and protecting abusers, even in the White House. I could talk about any number of things, but tonight I want us to talk about and think about gendered violence in the forms of harassment, assault, and bullying. And I also want us to think with me about the racial elements of gendered violence in this country. And keep in mind that I believe strongly that violence against any of us is a threat to safety for all of us. So, you know, it is interesting. I know at this point I could sort of just fast forward to, because everyone expects that I'm going to talk about 1991, and I will. And I could fast forward tonight, you know, to that part of the talk about 1991, but I want us to kind of be in today for a moment, because it really is a new day. It's a new day. I also think it's a new and troubling day, but I also think it's a new day for us to think boldly about equality, even with all of the challenges we have. So, but there are conflicts out there. It's hard for us to think that equality is in that sort of upward trajectory and that we're all on the same page. The election of Donald Trump, when it comes to just the issue of gendered violence, we have elected a man who flaunts sexual predation and misogyny as normal. And that moves us into a new space where, it moved us in a new space where the public seemingly accepted harassment and predation and assault. Yet in the past year, charges of sexual harassment against people maybe you had never even heard of, like Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer, that you probably have seen regularly on your television screen, and Charlie Rose, all of these made headlines when these men had to leave positions of prominence because of their behavior. And it's hard to know when you see those two pictures where this country is. What choices have we made? Where do we stand on the issues of gendered violence? And even today, even though we've seen these prominent men lose their positions, even today, we aren't quite sure if we have turned the corner to making sexual violence and gendered violence something that we refuse to accept. How many of you are absolutely certain today that this country abhors sexual violence? That we are willing to do something about it? So we're conflicted now. Hopefully, by the end of my time here, and I'm not going to keep you all night, hopefully by the end of my time, you will be a little less conflicted, because there is a path. And I think that path, and I'm absolutely sure that path, goes through our understanding of what it means to be caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, and what it truly means to be and to understand that we are tied in a single garment of destiny. I also want us to think about race, because, as I say, we're coming off Black History Month, it's Women's History Month, and frankly, because I cannot think about I can't think about gender without thinking about race. I was asked who one of my heroes are, and I gave three, actually, my mother was one, but another was A. Leon Higginbotham. And many of you may know him. Many of you may know him as a race man because he wrote a great treatise on race law and race and legal history, which is still in use in law schools today. But one of the things that he said to me late in his life is he always considered himself to be a race man, but he also said in life that he could never talk about race anymore without also talking about gender. And so I have continued to remember those words. So I will not talk about race. I will not talk about gender without talking about both of them. I live them both. And I acknowledge that, and I would say to you, every one of you, you live them both too. You live both your race and your gender, and you may not acknowledge it, but it is true. So why do I talk about race and gender both in the context of the confirmation hearing? Well, from the beginning, the confirmation hearing of 1991 for Judge Clarence Thomas was about race. It absolutely was about race. When George Bush nominated Clarence Thomas and said that he was nominated because he was the best man for the job, absolutely, no question, we all know that he was talking about trying to cover for the fact that he wanted to name an African American to take the place of Thurgood Marshall. That is why Clarence Thomas was chosen to take the place of Thurgood Marshall, but not just to be a body, but to replace Thurgood Marshall ideologically. So where Thurgood Marshall was the architect of the legal struggle for equality and a proponent of government intervention to redress racism's harms, Judge Thomas was an individualist. He believed that it was time for government to step aside and that individuals were the only way, through individual growth and development, that was the only way to have true equality, that the government's role was not important. And so that, in fact, went to the critical questions of race that we were experiencing in 1991 and that we are continuing to experience today. If you want to think about where we are today in terms of race, if you want to think about how we have a court that, in fact, can gut the Voting Rights Act in this country, think about that moment in history when we had a president who chose someone for the Supreme Court to get us to the point where government had no responsibility to protect the rights of individual citizens, the government had no responsibility to protect against racial discrimination, even in something as fundamental as voting. So think about that, and then you will understand how different, quite different. The country, we might have been in an entirely different place in terms of voting and political participation had we had a judge with a different philosophy on the Supreme Court when the Holder case came up before the court 5 years ago. But I also want us to think about Justice Marshall in terms of what I started out with, this inescapable network that we are all in. Because I believe that, in fact, the inescapable network of mutuality is not just something that we should feel as part of a community. The inescapable network and understanding us as an inescapable network of mutuality has to be read into our laws. It has to be a part of our best jurisprudence. So the contrast between Judge Thomas and Justice Marshall was individualism versus community. It was clear. And so we are where we are today, not where we should be, but we are in many ways where we are today because of Justice Marshall's jurisprudence. The advances that we have made in the law on racial issues, ethnic issues, gender identity, ableism, sexual identity hostilities, all of the advances we have made have been enabled by Justice Marshall's thinking and jurisprudence, whether he was as an advocate or on the bench. So 1991 can teach us something about race and about gender. If we are confused and conflicted today about where this country stands on those two issues, we can start with thinking about 1991. And I want to say specifically, I'll just move forward to say in 1991 does not exist in a vacuum. It happened in a backdrop of years of neglect of the issues of gendered violence. We didn't have the Violence Against Women Act. There had never been a full effort, either on the EEOC or the Department of Education, to protect the rights of women. Most of the cases that occurred, or many of the cases that were brought in the federal courts to fight discrimination under Title VII to protect women against harassment, many of those cases were dismissed. Courts routinely dismissed them as personal or private matters and concluded that no violations occurred. The policies that should have been in place in schools and in workplaces didn't exist. And so it's no wonder that women went to work knowing that they were going to confront this problem and just put up with it. They didn't speak up. Now, I will say it's no wonder that most women didn't file complaints. So if you think about the number of women who went to work and put up with the problem, numbers that, it's hard to know because no one even bothered to take surveys, or very few surveys that were reliable existed across the entire public sector or even the private sector. So you think about that number of people who have been harassed and abused in the workplace. Then you think about the number of people who filed a formal complaint. And it really was just a fraction of those people. but there were a few brave people whose names I want you to remember. The first one is a woman named Paulette Barnes. And have any of you heard of Paulette Barnes? Yes, thank you. Great, thank you. But most people have not. Sandra Bundy. Paulette Barnes filed her case, well known as Barnes versus Castle. For those of you who are lawyers, please look it up. You may not have heard about it in law school because even in the 90s, very few of these cases were taught as law that was important. Bundy versus Jackson is another case that you might want to look at. And Michelle Vinson. How many of you heard of Michelle Vinson? Not enough of you. Google her. But let me tell you something about Michelle Vinson. She is the Vinson versus Meritorious Savings Bank. She was the first plaintiff to have her case reach the Supreme Court. She prevailed in her case, but let me tell you what she had to go through to prevail. She was a 19-year-old bank teller, trainee in a bank. She had come from a family where she had basically been abandoned, so she had very limited resources. She didn't have support. She took a job, was hired by an individual who she thought and who had, was a leader in his church and a leader in the community. Nevertheless, very shortly after she started working in the Meritor Bank, her boss told her that in order to keep her job, she would have to have sex with him. And the facts show that over the next few years, Michelle Vinson, in fact, was forced to have sex with her boss between 50 and 60 times. She left her job, but they refused to allow her to get compensation, workman's compensation, even though she was entitled to it. She left the job as it was, as you could imagine, a stressful place for her to work. She was denied any kind of benefits, and she sued. Took her going to federal district court, the Court of Appeals, and then finally to the Supreme Court to find out, to hear a judge finally say definitively that what she had experienced, the sexual extortion that she had experienced, was in fact sexual harassment. Now, I've given you those names, Sandra Bundy, Paulette Barnes, and Michelle Vinson. I also want you to know that all of these women, and many of the women who filed sexual harassment cases early in the 70s and 80s were African American women. So this idea that we don't have a racial history with this issue is a false idea. I also give you these names because I want you to remember the names. And I say those names because I know I stand on the shoulders of those women. I did in 1991. I still do today. And all of those people who have come since then stand on the shoulders of a Michelle Vinson, and as do the women today in the Me Too movement. But for those women, we would not be where we are today. But think about where we were as a country when they came along. Think about the fact that in 1991, we had senators who refuse to look for the facts, who refuse to look for the truth, but in fact were more concerned about their processes and getting to a vote on Clarence Thomas than they were about the integrity of the court. Think about how difficult it might have been when you have elected officials in 1991 in the Clarence Thomas hearing, an elected official who is still in the Senate today, Orrin Hatch, wave a copy of The Exorcist to show that somehow maybe I had made up my testimony or that I was demonically possessed. You had senators relying on misogyny and mistruth, and I say their own set of alternative facts, to pass judgment on the character and fitness of a Clarence Thomas for the lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. You had Senator Danforth, who proposed that perhaps I was suffering from erotomania as the reason for my testimony. And their message was clear. Women who come forward are malicious or they're crazy. And that's what we had in 1991. So you can imagine what Michelle Vincent had to go through. Not just the court hearings, but the court of public opinion and the dismissal of officials who should have been embracing her. Now, let's turn a little bit to race now, because we also had the senators failing to call 3 women to testify about behavior that they had experienced at the hands of Clarence Thomas. Now this is where intersection comes in. It wasn't just that they were 3 women, but they were also 3 African-American women. And then finally, you have Clarence Thomas talking about the high-tech lynching. And the high-tech lynching metaphor was something that will live, as they say, in infamy. He claimed it was a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deigned to think for themselves or do for themselves or have different ideas. And through this appropriation of history and racial stereotypes, Thomas was able to portray himself as a man unjustly accused and a victim of racism. And why was he able to do this? Because we had representatives who did not understand the racial history of this country. They did not understand the gender history of this country and the racial violence, or excuse me, not only the racial violence that had been experienced, but the gendered violence. They didn't understand that, in fact, there was never any evidence of any African-American man being lynched on the words of an African-American woman. It was ahistorical. But they were willing to go along with it in part because they did not, and Thomas was able to argue it in part, because they didn't understand the fact that we were tied together, African-American men and women. And so they were willing to dismiss one of us, and of course, I was the one. But it wasn't just that they dismissed me, it was that they dismissed the stories and the experiences of all of us. All of us. When Senator Simpson said that I would be facing real harassment for coming forward, when he dismissed sexual harassment as crap, he was not only telling me to shut up, Simpson was silencing all victims. And at that point, what the message was to victims of sexual violence was that the government that you have elected doesn't care about your experiences. What it was saying was that we are not a part of the community, the political community, that they recognize. That we did not matter. I had testified because I believe that my experience mattered. It mattered not only to me, but it mattered to the integrity of the court. And today we are faced with the same kinds of questions. People ask me, they say, well, you know, what are we supposed to do when we have an individual who is running for office, and let's say, for example, a Bill Clinton. And we know that they are bad on certain behavioral characteristics, but we think they'll make good policy. So what do? I say we get better candidates. We get candidates who are not morally compromised and who will not be compromising our political choices, who will not be squandering our goodwill, who we will not have to apologize for when we vote for them. And we are at that moment now when we can support a whole new slate of candidates who can come to us and say, I so believe in the equality of women that I carry that through every aspect of my life. There may have been a time when we had to excuse and assume that sexual predation was just something men did, and especially powerful men did. But that day has passed. And for those who say nothing has changed since 1991, I say you're wrong. Because in 1991, there would not be a hall full of people applauding that line. So what are we to do? I know things have changed, but certainly not enough has. And I could list you many of the things that have changed. But I also have to be honest with you, and I have to tell you that we still are dealing with figures of between 1 and 3 women, or 1 out of 3 women between the ages of 18 and 34 say they have been harassed on the job. And few will report that behavior, and even fewer will file a formal complaint, as maybe even as low as 5% file formal complaints. And when they do file complaints, we still have numbers that suggest that as much as 60% of them will be retaliated against. The harassment of tipped workers is something that has been well documented. Workers who make minimum wages, even below minimum wages, and have to rely on tips, also have to put up with being pinched and kissed and touched without their approval just to get up to that living wage. There is this effort in the public discourse to just sort of live with it, accept sexual predatory behavior as something that men do. And there's we could see why people might do that because sexual harassment is so prevalent. But just because something is prevalent doesn't mean it is normal. And it certainly doesn't mean that it has to be. But in order to make sure that everyone knows that, we have to punish people who behave badly, who misbehave, even if we say, well, they're good people. Even if they're people who we think are our friends and who might agree with us, we still have to show that our agreement around sexual violence is stronger than our individual friendships. We must also realize, and I hope this little glimpse into history helps us to realize, that harassment victims come in every class, race, age, shape, color, sexual identity, religion, and any other identity factor that you can name. It's about abuse. It's not, as they would have you believe, about sexual attraction. Now, I say that it doesn't discriminate, sexual harassment doesn't discriminate, but I would also say that harassment affects people differently. There are racial elements to the effect, where some women do not want to come forward because they do not want to shame the race by admitting that they are victims, or they don't want to shame the race by admitting that they have been victimized by somebody of their own race. But there are other elements that we have to be mindful of as well, and that is class. Even today, there are women whose wages are so low, whose economic stability is so tenuous, that they dare not speak out against the abuse they experience. They can't afford to. And it doesn't matter how many women they see come forward. They cannot risk losing a job and putting their families in peril by stepping up and complaining. So we are not there yet. And there's one or two other factors that I want us to consider that makes me understand that as much as we say we have come forward, we still have some things that we need to address in order to get where we need to be. Last year, Georgetown Center on Poverty and Equality issued what I call a chilling report. It's called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. The School Center on Poverty and Inequality detailed data showing that adults view black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, even as young as 5 years old. So what does that mean? It means that, and this is their interpretation, that compared to white girls of the same age, survey participants perceive that black girls need less nurturing and support, were more independent, and knew more about adult topics, including sex, than their peers. And to the authors, this meant that black girls these myths about black girls potentially contributed to the disproportionate rates of punitive treatment in education and juvenile justice systems. So if you think that a child doesn't need nurturing, doesn't need protection, you are more likely to punish her. And that's another indication of this sort of racial gender divide that we see. But I even see the repercussions as more extreme, even broader. I see these perceptions will feed into the treatment of women in the adult justice system. These notions can impede black girls and women's willingness to seek help from the legal system if we believe that the legal system is not there to help us and protect us. and they are less likely to be believed when they do. And there is clear evidence of that as well. So think about what that means even today for the chance of a black girl to get a fair hearing and be taken seriously when she raises claims of sexual harassment in many of our elementary and junior high school in this country. We have a long way to go again to get beyond our racist and sexist notions. And right now, we are not there yet. And the consequences are dire. Black and brown women are the fastest growing demographic in the prison population today. And according to the MacArthur Foundation and a Vera Institute co-published report, this development can be traced back to trauma, including sexual and domestic violence in the lives of people going into prison. So sexual violence has consequences that we are only beginning to comprehend. Sexual violence has consequences to the individuals who experience them, but the consequences don't end there. For those who really believe that what affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly, you must be concerned about this problem that has plagued women throughout history and that continues today and seems to even be growing. And we must not only just be concerned to think about it, but we have to begin to act. So how do we begin to act? I know that there is legislation being pressed in our federal Congress. I also know that the state of California is considering legislative action. So what do we do if, in fact, we believe that we are caught up in this inescapable network of mutuality, that we are, in fact, tied in a single garment with sexual assault victims? What do you do as voters? Well, the first thing that you do is that you talk to your representatives. And I know you don't have to talk to Barbara Lee because she knows. But talk to your representatives in Sacramento. You should call, email, write. Tell them that this has to be a priority of our society because it is something, this problem is hurting all of us. You should also share your stories. And that's a difficult thing for some people to do, even today. But there is nothing more liberating, not only to yourself, but to younger generations, than hearing and sharing the stories of what it's really like to live and work in an environment where women are routinely demeaned and abused. If we don't tell those stories, they will never be heard, and we can never put a lie to the story that society tells us that these things just don't happen. We've got to break this culture of silence. And sharing stories helps that. We can support the sharing of stories of others who come forward. Last night I was at an event, and one woman said that not only should we be sharing our stories, but we should be sharing the mic to let other people who have not been heard tell their stories as well. So we have to be the models of what we want our young people to be. If we can't come forward in my age and talk about what it means, how can we expect another generation will be? Now, I just ask you, what does it mean to be caught up in a network of mutuality, to really believe that what affects one directly, it affects all of us indirectly? What does it mean in terms of sexual violence? Everybody in this room has to answer that question for themselves. What motivates you to move will be different from me. I was motivated because I saw a nominee for the Supreme Court who had in fact put himself above the law that he was sworn to protect. And I spoke up. People ask me if I had it to do all over again, would I do it, given the treatment that I experienced? And I have never wavered. The answer is yes, I would do it again. What I had to say mattered, and maybe they didn't understand that it mattered. Maybe they understood too well in the Senate that it mattered. But I would do it again. And all of the years have not been easy. And I could have turned back at any point and said, I'm giving up on this. But I believe that I stayed in it to see this moment that we are experiencing right now. And I am in it to stay. And I have also, I know Congresswoman Lee had a mentor when she was going into politics. And so I would just like to say that at this point, even though I didn't know Shirley Chisholm, she has mentored me from the words that she has said. And so I will paraphrase the words of Shirley Chisholm to show where I am today. And that is, when it's all over, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 21st century and who dared to be a catalyst for change. And I invite you to be that catalyst for change in whatever way you can. We can make a difference in this world. We can turn this corner at this point and at this time, and the moment is now to stand up against the violence that we have too long accepted as normal and the status quo. We can do this. Thank you. Thank you tonight. It could start right here in Oakland, California.
Once again, you guys, Professor Anita Hill. We've had some challenges here tonight, and I just want to reiterate them as you leave. Listen to your challenge. Professor Hill has challenged us to fight inequality and bring justice for all, and break the culture of silence. Honorable Elihu Harris has challenged us to consider how you will be the one. How you will be the one. And finally, our own Congresswoman Barbara Lee has challenged us to always stay woke. And remember that today is a historic moment in Oakland, California. It will go down in the history books. Today, March 10th, 2018, our historic moment in the fight. Thank you so much for your time.